welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're exploring two stories put together, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 and the story of Jesus walking on water, both as the author of John's Gospel tells them. Before we dive into either of those, however, you may find it helpful, if you've not done so already, to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You'll find the link for that just below the video in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of the reading that we're looking at today, some other passages you may find it helpful to consult, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and plenty of space for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So then, without further ado, let's dive into today's reading, which comes from John's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 1 to 21. In following the lectionary, the set readings for each week, we've spent a lot of time recently in Mark's Gospel, but today we kind of step in a different direction back into the world of John's Gospel. Now, in the story as John tells it, Jesus has been up to Jerusalem for a major festival. We're not told which one. And now he's returned to Galilee. That time in Jerusalem was one of conflict. He'd healed a man who was basically paralysed, and done so on the Sabbath, which attracted the ire of the religious authorities. And so that healing is in verses 1 to 9 of chapter 5. And then the remainder of it, verses kind of 9, second part thereof, to 47, is basically Jesus in conflict with those religious leaders. Having returned to Galilee, the action takes place around the Sea of Galilee. And John gives it one of its other names. He calls it the Sea of Tiberias. And Tiberias was a major city in the vicinity of the Sea of Galilee. Now, the timing as well as the geographical location of today's story is really important. It's described as being at Passover, so this is a specific Jewish festival. And Passover recalled both God's liberation of the people from oppression in Egypt, bringing them out of that situation, and also God's provision for the people while they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. The people grumbled at Moses about the lack of food, decent food, and God supplied manna from heaven to feed the people, enough for each person each day to keep going. And so that forms some of the background. It's why John tells us the time. It's Passover, so we need to keep that in mind as we look particularly at verses 1 to 15 today. The other thing to note in terms of setting the scene is, as we said when we looked at Jesus stilling the storm a few weeks ago, Mark's version of that story, the Sea of Galilee is one in which the weather can turn very suddenly. It often gets really hot during the day, and as it cools down, ferocious winds can rise up seemingly out of nothing and create very stormy conditions where a few minutes before it was perfectly calm and safe feeling. And that sets the scene for the second incident that we have today in verses 16 to 21, that of Jesus walking on water. We have, as you might expect with 21 verses, quite a few different characters to get to grips with here. So first off, we've got Jesus' disciples, including but not limited to the 12. And we know from verse 3 of today's reading that they'd sought somewhere to go for peace and reflection with Jesus, which is why they ascend up a mountain. They were looking for quiet. Amongst the disciples were two particularly significant characters. You had Andrew, who was famous more for being the brother of Simon Peter than necessarily in his own right, but he'd brought Peter to Jesus when the disciples were first being called. We find that in chapter 1, verses 35 to 42. And we also have Philip, who was another early disciple who emerged at that point. He brought Nathanael to Jesus, as we learn in chapter 1, verses 43 to 46. And it's interesting with having Peter and Andrew as the two disciples who are kind of the go-betweens with people beyond the 12 in this passage, because they do similar things again in chapter 12, verse 22, when they try and bring some Greeks who want to come and speak to Jesus into conversation with him, and it doesn't quite work out maybe how they expected. We have in this story an unnamed boy of indeterminate age, but a boy who we know was extremely generous, who was willing to share what food he had with others. We see that in verse 9, and it's through his generosity that the tremendous crowds of about 5,000 men and an unknown number of women and children would be fed. Crowds who wanted, in response to what Jesus had done, to make him their king, as we will see in verse 15. And finally, kind of in the background of things, we have the mysterious figure of the prophet. Now, that figure was mentioned right back in chapter 1 by John the Baptist when he denied being said prophet. And that prophet was understood to be a kind of Moses-like figure who would lead the people of Israel into their next phase of kind of freedom and liberation. And we find reference to that in Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 to 18. And it seems as if some of the people here thought Jesus was that prophet. And it led them a step further to say, well, maybe Jesus is the Messiah. Maybe he's our king come again in the line of David. So there's a lot of different figures in this story. And the author of John's Gospel, I think, actually features, in a sense. John's was the last of the four Gospels to be written, around 90 to 95 of the Common Era. And there's a lot of complex theological reflection that underpins John's accounts of things. So the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is found in all four Gospels. And as we'll see in a moment, there are similarities across all four. But there are distinct differences, and I think that comes through in John's particular theological reflection. As I've already hinted at, it's useful for us to keep in mind Exodus 16, which is the story of Moses and the manna from heaven. And I'll say a bit more about that when we come to those bits of the story of the feeding of the 5,000 where it's relevant. So we've set the scene. There was a lot of scene to set. Now let's dive into the detail of the passage. And we'll begin with verses 1 to 15. We'll begin with the feeding of the 5,000. If you want to look at the other accounts that we have in the Synoptic Gospels, you can find them at Mark 6, verses 30 to 44, Matthew 14, verses 13 to 22, and Luke 9, verses 10 to 17. So they're parallel accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. And as I've already noted, there are some details that are common to all four accounts. So we have the feeding of the 5,000 taking place in a kind of oasis of grass, as verse 10 indicates to us, in the middle of what was a semi-arid kind of setting, as we learn in verse 2. As we find out in verse 9, we've got meagre resources being able to feed thousands of people, as we see in verse 10. We've got instructions being given to the disciples to feed all those people, as we see in verse 5. We've got a very particular pattern that Jesus uses as he works with the bread. He takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it away. We see that pattern in verse 11. All four accounts tell us that there were 12 baskets of leftovers collected. We see that here in verse 13. And that all of the people there were able to eat enough. All were full. And we see that in verse 12. So there's a lot of points at each stage where there are common connections with the synoptic accounts, those in Matthew, Mark and Luke. But there were also some distinct differences. And I think by far the most significant one comes in verse 4 of today's reading, where John tells us that it's Passover once again. And that invites us to make connections with the other two times in John's Gospel where it's emphasised that it was Passover. So in chapter 2, verses 13 to 22, Jesus makes his first foray to Jerusalem that we hear about in his public ministry and cleanses the temple. And in chapter 11, verse 55 onwards, we get that the setting of Jesus' final days was in the run-up to Passover. And indeed for John, Passover is Good Friday. So as well as taking today's reading about the abundance of the kingdom of God into the picture, we need to also think about the cleansing of the temple and the death and resurrection of Jesus and see it as a unit. I think that's one of the things John invites us to do with the timing, as well as to be aware of Moses and manna and the Exodus story. In this story, we learn that it was Jesus' signs that drew the crowds to him. We learn that in verse 2. And that's a bit of an odd point if you think about it, because John's already made it very clear that there's a level of inadequacy about signs as something that can lead to authentic discipleship. So we see that in verses 23 to 25 of chapter 2, in chapter 3, verse 2 with Nicodemus, and in chapter 5, verses 1 to 15, in reaction to the healing that led to the conflict immediately preceding today's episode. This business of seeking out signs, I think, goes some way to explaining how it was that the crowds missed the point of what Jesus had done by providing food for them. And as if we go on to read through to verse 26 of chapter 6, you'll find Jesus is completely aware of what's going on here. There's lots of full bellies, but there's very few full hearts. Now, in the mountainy wilderness area into which Jesus and the disciples had retreated, as we learn in verse 3, there were no nearby towns from which to go and buy food for the large crowds. It's interesting that in verses 5 to 10, we have a lot of detail about the exchanges that go on between Jesus and Andrew and Philip and the young boy. Exchanges that we don't hear about, interestingly, in the Synoptic Gospels. There's a lot more depth here. It's a lot more personal. And as verse 6 shows us, the order of events in John's telling of it is turned on its head compared to what we see in the Synoptics. In the Synoptic Gospels, the disciples come to Jesus and say, how are we going to feed these people? Whereas in John's Gospel, Jesus is the one who challenges them to do it. Now we see in verses 7 to 9 that Andrew and Philip didn't actually know what to do. They thought, well, 6 months worth of wages, which we don't have anyway, is not going to buy even a morsel really for all these people. But Andrew had found a young lad who had 5 loaves and 2 fish and was willing to come to Jesus. It was that young boy's generosity being brought to Jesus' attention that changed the situation. And as I say, it's interesting that Andrew and Philip tend to be the ones who reach out to others beyond the immediate circle of disciples. The 5,000 men, and presumably however many women and children there also were encouraged to sit down in groups, as we learn in verse 10. And unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, after Jesus has taken and blessed and broken and given out the food, he doesn't hand it to the disciples to distribute, but gives it out himself. And the crowd's satisfaction when they're full, as we learn in verse 12, mirrors the Exodus story, Exodus 16:18, and the way in which each person was able to gather enough manna every day to fill them up. Now, the crowd's reaction to this is very interesting, and it takes us back to John the Baptist, Jesus' older cousin and his forerunner. See, in chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, he denied that he was the prophet that I talked about, this mysterious Moses-like figure. And the crowds presumably were aware that John had denied being the prophet, and instead they latched on to Jesus. They were looking for fresh hope and new leadership, I think, in the midst of occupancy by the puppet king, Herod, and the really hated Romans. And they make a kind of leap, it seems, in their imaginations from Jesus might be the prophet to Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is our wannabe king. And they try to make him king somewhat against his will. And Jesus slips away, as we learn in verse 15, and goes back up that mountain to be by himself. He doesn't want a part of the expectations it seems the crowd were trying to load onto him. So that's the feeding of the 5,000. That brings us to verses 16 to 21 and Jesus walking on water. We've got two parallels for this in the other Gospels. We don't have one in Luke, but we do have in Mark 6 verses 45 to 52 and Matthew 14 verses 23 to 33. So again, there are other versions that you can go and have a look at. Now, as with the feeding of the 5,000, the story of the Exodus is very much in the background again here, and the figure of Moses. In Exodus 14, verses 15 to 31, Moses had, with the help of God, parted the waters of the Red Sea so that the people could escape the pursuing Egyptians and get to safety out in the wilderness. And I think by having Jesus walking on water, there's a kind of invocation of that, this idea of Jesus as the new Moses. I think we see that in verse 19. We know, as I've just said, that the crowds wanted to make Jesus something that he wasn't, in that sort of new Moses prophet type figure. But it does bring home to us, because Matthew and Mark have the same presentation of events, that this business of casting Jesus as the new Moses by linking these stories together is very deliberate. It begs the question as to whether John got his story from the Synoptic Gospels or some kind of other independent source, and the scholarly jury is still out on that. What we can say is we know from verses 16 and 17 that the disciples have made the decision to head over the few miles to Capernaum without Jesus with them, because he'd gone up the mountain to be by himself. Now, Jewish people were not known for being seafarers. They led that to their Phoenician neighbours up in the north. And even fishermen, people like Simon Peter and Andrew, and for that matter Philip and Nathaniel, knew the waters of the Sea of Galilee really well. But even they could get caught out by sudden strong winds and changes of weather conditions. And we see that happening in verse 18, though interestingly, compared to Mark and Matthew's accounts, John's is very sort of understated. He plays down the extremity of the weather, and I think the focus for him is more on Jesus and the disciples being reunited, as we'll see. Now, the Sea of Galilee was about 12 miles long and 7 miles wide at its widest point. So, as I say, they were most of the way to Capernaum when in verse 19 they saw Jesus walking out towards them on the water. And perfectly understandably, they were terrified. They were absolutely petrified. But Jesus reassures them by saying, "It's me." And that's interesting because the same Greek words, "it's me," could be translated as the formula, "I am," which goes right back to Moses and the burning bush. God's "I am who I am." And so Jesus is potentially using the divine declaration, though I think, as much as John does like to play with double meanings, I think he's basically saying, "It's me, don't be scared" here. But it's interesting that when we look at chapter 8, verses 24, 28 and 58, Jesus is very much using the "I am" as the divine formula. So it could be in John, with the double meanings, a bit of both. Now, unlike in the Synoptic Gospels, note that Jesus is the only one who gets to speak in this passage. It's a theophany, it's a divine speech, divine act. And note we don't have Peter walking out on the water to meet Jesus in this story either. What we do have is Jesus being recognised for who he is, not mistaken for a ghostly figure, as we see in Matthew 14:26 and Mark 6:49. And instead, the disciples want to receive Jesus onto their boat, we see in verse 21. The Greek word that's used here for receive is the same one we saw right back in chapter 1 in verses 12 and 13, in reference to how few people will receive Jesus as who he really is, how few people will become true disciples. And so the word choice emphasizes the importance of this reunion of Jesus with the disciples. It's a story in which terror was turned to gladness by the presence of Jesus. And you don't need me to say that that's rich sermon fodder for preachers. There's a lot you can draw out from that. And note that immediately after this incident, in verses 22 to 25, the crowds continue to follow Jesus around. It seems in expectation of a free meal more than anything else. So they've really quite spectacularly missed the point of who Jesus is. It becomes all about him meeting their material needs as far as they're concerned, and not really about the kingdom of God in its fullness at all. And that's a really interesting one for thinking about mission as churches. Do we overemphasize needs meeting instead of proclaiming the kingdom of God? And what do the two actually look like in relationship anyway? There's a lot of deep questions to explore that come out of these fruitful stories that John brings together for us.